Principal calls cops on black parents over racism complaint, instantly regrets it. The Johnson family had always been involved in their community. They were the type of parents who made sure their child, Marcus, knew how to advocate for himself and speak up when something didn't feel right. Marcus, a bright 15-year-old, had always done well in school. He had a passion for history and was an avid reader. However, in recent months, his experience at his high school had changed. At first, it was subtle. Marcus began to feel different. He noticed that some of the students in his class would make comments about his appearance, comments that were uncomfortable and unwelcoming. "You're not like the other black kids," one of the students had told him in passing. At first, Marcus didn't know how to respond. He brushed it off, thinking maybe he had misunderstood. But the remarks didn't stop. They grew more frequent, and even some teachers began to make him feel excluded. It wasn't just the students, it was the atmosphere in the school. It wasn't long before Marcus began to dread going to school. His once confident smile started to fade, and his grades, which had always been excellent, started slipping. His parents, Angela and Robert Johnson, noticed the changes in their son. They saw the sadness in his eyes when he came home and the tiredness in his demeanor. One evening, Angela asked him what was wrong, and at first he didn't say anything. But after some gentle coaxing, Marcus opened up about the comments he had been hearing at school. Angela felt a wave of anger and sadness. Robert was just as upset, but he tried to stay calm. "We need to do something about this," he said. "This isn't right." The next day, Angela and Robert made an appointment to meet with the school principal, Mr. Stevens. They felt it was important to address the issue directly. They had been patient, hoping that Marcus's experience was just a phase, but now they knew something needed to change. When they walked into the principal's office, they were met with a somewhat cold reception. Mr. Stevens, a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose, had always been polite but distant. He greeted them briefly, and they took their seats across from his desk. Angela spoke first, her voice steady but filled with concern. "Mr. Stevens, we've been noticing a change in Marcus's behavior recently. And after talking with him, we learned he's been experiencing some troubling comments and behavior at school, mostly related to his race. We wanted to bring this to your attention so we can work together to make sure this doesn't continue." Mr. Stevens, who had been looking through a stack of papers, looked up and adjusted his glasses. He paused, and for a moment Angela wondered if he understood the seriousness of the situation. "Racism, you say?" he asked, his tone somewhat dismissive. "Well, I'm sure it's not as bad as you think. Kids can be thoughtless, but they don't mean anything by it. I'll speak with some of the students and teachers, but I'm sure it'll blow over." Angela's heart sank. She had hoped for more empathy, more understanding. Robert, who had been quiet up until that point, leaned forward. "We understand that kids sometimes say things without thinking, but it's not just a few comments. It's a pattern, and it's affecting Marcus's well-being. We want to make sure that the school is doing everything it can to address this. It's not just about him, it's about all the students who might be experiencing this." Mr. Stevens, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation, gave a half-hearted nod. "I'll look into it," he said, but there was no real sense of urgency in his voice. Angela and Robert exchanged a glance, their frustration growing. They had hoped for a conversation that would lead to action, not a brush-off. Angela decided to push further. "We're not asking for much," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We just want to make sure this doesn't continue, and we want to know that the school is doing its part to create a safe and inclusive environment for all students. We're ready to work with you on this." Mr. Stevens, now looking uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. "I understand your concerns," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But you have to understand we can't just go around accusing people of racism without proof. I don't want to make any hasty decisions." Angela's patience was wearing thin. "We're not accusing anyone, Mr. Stevens. We're telling you what our son is experiencing, and it's having a real impact on him. If you can't address this now, we will have to consider other options. We're serious about ensuring Marcus's safety and well-being." The principal finally seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation. He paused, then reluctantly agreed to follow up on the complaint. "Fine," he said. "I'll speak with the students involved and see if there's anything we can do. But I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be." As the meeting wrapped up, Angela and Robert left the office feeling unsettled. They had hoped for a more understanding response, but it seemed clear that Mr. Stevens wasn't taking their concerns seriously. They knew they would have to stay vigilant and take further steps if the situation didn't improve. Later that evening, Angela and Robert discussed what their next steps would be. Angela suggested that they reach out to the school district's diversity and inclusion department to ensure that the school was truly addressing these issues. Robert agreed, but he also felt a rising sense of frustration. "Why does it always feel like we have to fight for basic respect?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Marcus, who had been quietly listening to his parents, spoke up. "I just want to go to school and feel like I belong," he said softly. His words broke their hearts. They had always taught him to stand up for himself, but now it felt like they were the ones fighting for him. The next day, as they made the call to the district, they had no idea how the situation would unfold, but they were determined to see this through. They knew they couldn't let their son, or any other child, suffer in silence. The next morning, things began to escalate quickly. Angela and Robert received an unexpected call from the school. The voice on the other end of the line was Mr. Stevens, the principal. He sounded unusually tense as he spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice more strained than usual. "I've thought more about our conversation yesterday. I believe we need to address this issue in a way that will ensure everyone is heard." Angela and Robert exchanged looks, their hearts racing. They had hoped for action, but they hadn't expected the principal to call them so soon. "What exactly do you have in mind?" Robert asked cautiously, sensing that something wasn't quite right. "Well, I think it might be helpful if we have a more formal discussion, perhaps with some support from local authorities," Mr. Stevens said. "We want to make sure the situation doesn't get out of hand, and I believe involving the police could help maintain order." Angela felt a rush of disbelief. "Police," she repeated, her voice shaking. "We're not talking about a crime here. We're discussing a serious issue of racism affecting our son." She could barely believe what she was hearing. "I understand, Mr. Stevens quickly added, "But I think it's important to handle the situation professionally, and I believe this is the best course of action for everyone involved." Angela could hardly contain her frustration. "You're saying that calling the police is the solution to a conversation about racism? Are you serious?" Robert, sensing that the conversation was only going to get more heated, stepped in. "Mr. Stevens," he said firmly, "this is not about creating conflict. This is about our child being treated unfairly. We expected you to take this seriously, not escalate it to the police." The principal hesitated before responding. "I'm just trying to ensure that everything is done by the book," he replied. "The situation could potentially get out of hand, and I don't want to risk anything." Angela was stunned. "You're the one who's making this worse by bringing in law enforcement. This is a discussion about racism, not a crime." "Look, Mr. Stevens said, his voice suddenly colder, "I've made my decision. I'll have an officer here later today to meet with all of us." Before Angela or Robert could respond, the line went dead. Both of them were left standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the phone in disbelief. They had been expecting a more thoughtful response, but this was beyond what they could have imagined. "I can't believe he just did that," Angela whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "He didn't even listen to us." Robert shook his head, anger and disappointment clear on his face. "This is exactly what we're talking about. Instead of addressing the issue of racism, he's bringing in the police. How does that solve anything?" They both sat down, trying to process what had just happened. Marcus, who had been listening in the other room, came in quietly. He looked at his parents with concern. "What's going on?" Angela took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. "The principal called the police. He thinks we need them to keep things under control." Marcus's eyes widened in shock. "The police? For what?" Robert let out a frustrated sigh. "For raising a concern about racism at your school." Marcus, trying to keep calm, turned to his parents. "I didn't mean for all this to happen. I just wanted to feel safe at school." Angela pulled her son into a hug. "This isn't your fault, Marcus. We're fighting for you, and we won't let them do this to you." The day passed slowly for the Johnsons. They were both angry and heartbroken, but they also knew that they had to stay strong. They spent the morning trying to contact the school district, hoping someone there would intervene. However, when they called the district's office, they were met with the same vague responses. Meanwhile, at the school, Mr. Stevens made a series of phone calls to local law enforcement, requesting an officer to come to the school and monitor the situation. He wasn't quite sure what he expected, but he felt a sense of control when the officer agreed to arrive that afternoon. When the officer, Officer Harris, arrived at the school, Mr. Stevens briefed him on the situation. The officer, who was familiar with the school but not with the specifics of the Johnson family's complaint, listened carefully. "I understand the need to ensure safety," Officer Harris said, "but I'm not sure why I'm here. From what I'm hearing, this sounds like a school issue." Mr. Stevens explained that the situation could escalate, and he felt the need to have a law enforcement presence. "We just want to make sure nothing goes wrong, especially if the parents are going to get upset," he explained. Officer Harris was skeptical. "I'm here to make sure things don't get out of hand, but I don't think this requires my involvement. It's a matter of talking and understanding. The police aren't usually the solution to a disagreement between parents and the school." Despite Officer Harris's reluctance, he agreed to stay and observe the meeting. He sat quietly in the background as the Johnsons arrived at the school later that afternoon. Angela and Robert, still furious, were now more determined than ever to stand their ground. When they entered the principal's office, they saw the officer standing near the door, a silent witness to the conversation. The sight of him made their blood boil, but they tried to stay calm. Mr. Stevens was already seated at his desk, his posture rigid and uncomfortable. "Thank you for coming," he said, almost nervously. "I've called in Officer Harris to ensure everything goes smoothly." Angela, trying to keep her voice steady, responded, "We don't need the police here, Mr. Stevens. We need you to listen to us and take our complaint seriously." "Right," Mr. Stevens said quickly, "but I thought it would be best to have a third party here in case things got out of hand." Robert spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "You're treating us like criminals when all we want is for our son to feel safe. We've asked for your help, and instead you've decided to escalate this situation." Officer Harris, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "I'm here to keep the peace," he said, looking at both parties. "But it's clear to me that this is an issue that needs to be handled through conversation, not confrontation. Let's try to work through it calmly." Angela took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions bubbling up inside her. "We don't need the police here to tell us that. What we need is for the school to take responsibility for what Marcus is going through and make real changes." The officer nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I can see that. This is something that needs to be addressed properly, Mr." Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was beginning to understand that he had made a mistake, but it was too late now. The tension in the room was thick, and it was clear to everyone present that this was no longer just about Marcus's experience. It was about a system that had failed to act. The following days after the meeting were tense. Angela and Robert felt a mix of anger and frustration, but they knew they had to stay focused. Their main concern was Marcus, and they wanted to make sure that the school didn't sweep his complaints under the rug. As parents, they were ready to do whatever it took to protect him and ensure he felt safe and valued. The word quickly spread around the school about what had happened. The incident with the police had caused shockwaves through the community, and people began to talk. Some were sympathetic to the Johnson family, while others criticized the school's actions. Among the students, many were confused. They didn't fully understand the situation, but they knew that something wasn't right. At home, Marcus had a lot of mixed feelings. He wanted to go back to school, but he wasn't sure what awaited him there. Every day, he wondered if things would be different or if the atmosphere would remain tense. He was hoping for some kind of resolution, but it seemed like nothing was changing. One afternoon, Marcus came home from school looking more troubled than usual. Angela, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner, noticed the change immediately. "Marcus, what's wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Marcus hesitated before answering. "It's just everything feels off at school. Some of the kids are still making comments, and now I can tell people are talking about me. It's like they don't know whether to believe me or think I'm overreacting." Angela's heart broke for her son. She could hear the pain in his voice, the uncertainty that came from not feeling safe in a place where he was supposed to learn and grow. She hugged him tightly. "I'm so sorry you're going through this, Marcus," she whispered, "but we're going to make sure this stops. You're not alone in this." That evening, Angela and Robert sat down together to discuss their next steps. They knew that if they didn't push for real action now, things might never change. "We need to escalate this," Robert said, his voice firm. We need to involve the school district and make sure they take this seriously. We can't let them ignore it. Angela nodded. I agree. We need to show them that we won't back down. They need to understand that this isn't just about our family. It's about all the kids at that school who might be going through the same thing. The next day, Robert made a call to the school district's office. He explained the situation again, emphasizing that the principal had made a huge mistake by involving the police rather than addressing the racism directly. The district representative listened carefully, but Robert could tell they weren't fully grasping the seriousness of the issue. We'll have to investigate this, the representative said, but you know it might take some time. That's not good enough, Robert replied, his voice rising slightly. Our son's well-being is at stake here. This needs to be handled now. Angela spoke up, her voice steady but full of resolve. We're asking for more than just an investigation. We want real, tangible changes. We want policies in place that prevent this from happening again, and we want accountability. The district representative promised to look into it, but Robert and Angela knew they had to keep the pressure on. They weren't going to wait around for change. They were going to push for it. At school, the situation continued to unfold. Some students took sides, either supporting Marcus or defending the school's actions, but most of the students seemed unsure of where they stood. They didn't know how to process what had happened or how to handle the tension that had developed. One morning, Marcus walked into school and was immediately confronted by one of his classmates. The student, a boy named Jake, had always been friendly to Marcus before, but now he seemed awkward. Hey, Marcus, Jake said, his voice hesitating. I just wanted to say that I heard about what happened with the police. I don't know what to think about it, but I hope you're okay. Marcus was taken aback by Jake's sudden shift in attitude. He wasn't sure if Jake was trying to be kind or if he was just confused. Thanks, Marcus said, his voice flat. I'm okay, but it's been hard, you know. Jake nodded, but his expression was uncertain. Yeah, I get it, but I don't know, it just feels like there's so much going on. I don't know what's true and what's not. Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and frustration. He wanted to explain everything to Jake, to tell him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. But instead, he stayed silent. He didn't feel like explaining himself anymore. He didn't feel like defending his own experiences to someone who might not fully understand. Meanwhile, the tension in the school continued to rise. Other students began to notice that things weren't right. Some teachers who had seen the way Marcus had been treated started to step in and offer support. Mrs. Carter, Marcus's history teacher, was one of the first to reach out. She had always been kind to him, but now she made it clear that she stood by him. You've been a great student, Marcus, she said one afternoon after class had ended. And what's happening to you isn't right. I want you to know that I'm here for you if you need anything. Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Thanks, Mrs. Carter, I appreciate it. As the days passed, more teachers began to take notice and speak out. Some of them sent emails to the principal, urging him to address the situation more seriously. Others talked to their students, encouraging them to speak out against racism and to support their classmates who were affected by it. The small acts of support from teachers started to make Marcus feel like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But he wasn't sure. He wasn't ready to trust that everything would work out. At home, Angela and Robert continued to fight for change. They were in constant communication with the school district, and they kept pushing for answers. But despite all their efforts, it seemed like progress was slow. The district promised a meeting to discuss the situation, but it felt like a far-off hope rather than an immediate solution. One day after school, Marcus came home with a small glimmer of hope. Mom, Dad, he said as he walked into the living room. I talked to some of the other students today. Some of them are starting to understand. They're asking me questions, wanting to know what's really going on. Maybe people are starting to get it. Angela and Robert exchanged a look of cautious optimism. That's great, Marcus, Angela said, her voice full of encouragement. You're helping to make a difference just by being honest about your experience. Marcus smiled weakly, but the weight of the situation was still heavy on him. He wasn't sure if things would change, but he had learned something important in the process. He wasn't alone. Even if not everyone understood what he had been through, there were people who cared, people who were willing to listen. As the week drew to a close, the tension at school seemed to ease just a little. Students and teachers alike began to open up more about the issue of racism, and while there was still a long way to go, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like there was a path forward, a way to heal, to move forward, and to keep advocating for what was right. The weeks after the meeting at the school were filled with mixed emotions. Marcus had returned to school, but the air was still tense. Although the principal, Mr. Stevens, had promised to address the issue, things felt far from resolved. Marcus still faced uncomfortable looks from some students, and while some of the teachers were supportive, others remained distant, unsure of how to approach the situation. But Marcus wasn't alone. His parents, Angela and Robert, were tirelessly pushing for real change. They weren't going to let their son's experience be ignored or swept under the rug. Every day, they followed up with the school district, asking for updates, pushing for action. They weren't going to back down. Angela had always believed in the power of advocacy, and Robert was equally determined. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they believed their fight was bigger than just their family. It was about changing the culture at the school, about making sure no other student had to endure what Marcus had gone through. One day, the phone rang at the Johnson household. It was a call they had been waiting for. It was from the school district. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson. This is Mary Lewis from the district office. I wanted to speak with you about the meeting you requested regarding your son, Marcus. We've reviewed the situation thoroughly, and we'd like to set up a time to meet with you and Mr. Johnson to discuss the next steps," the voice on the other end said. Angela's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they had been pushing for. "Thank you, Ms. Lewis. We've been waiting for this. When can we meet?" They scheduled a meeting for the following week. It was clear that the district was taking the situation seriously, but Angela and Robert knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to see action. The day of the meeting finally arrived. Angela and Robert entered the school district's office, their nerves on edge but their resolve stronger than ever. They were greeted by Ms. Lewis, who led them into a conference room. Sitting at the table were several district officials, including the superintendent and a representative from the Diversity and Inclusion Department. The room was filled with a quiet tension. The district officials knew that this meeting would be a turning point. They had heard the Johnsons' concerns and were now facing the consequences of the principal's actions. It was clear that the district needed to make things right. "We've reviewed the incident thoroughly, and we recognize that the school's response was inadequate," the superintendent began. "We understand that involving the police was a mistake, and we deeply regret the way this situation was handled." Angela and Robert exchanged a glance. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the acknowledgement of their concerns. But they knew the real test would be whether the district would follow through with meaningful change. "We appreciate your apology," Robert said, his voice steady but firm. "But words are just the first step. We need to see real action. We want to know what steps will be taken to prevent something like this from happening again." Ms. Lewis nodded. "We understand, Mr. Johnson. We have already begun to implement new training for all staff, including teachers and administrators, on how to handle issues of discrimination and racism. This will include regular workshops and sensitivity training. We also plan to update the school's anti-discrimination policies to ensure that they're more comprehensive and enforceable." Angela listened carefully, her mind working through the details. "That's a good start," she said. "But we also want to make sure that these changes are enforced. It's one thing to have a policy in place, but if it's not being followed, it doesn't matter." The district officials nodded in agreement. "We'll ensure that the new policies are followed through with accountability measures," the superintendent assured them. "We're also planning to hold a school-wide assembly to address the issues of racism and inclusion. We want to make sure all students and staff are aware of the importance of respect and understanding." Robert leaned forward slightly. "And what about the principal? We need to know that he's held accountable for his actions. Calling the police on our family was completely inappropriate, and it shouldn't have happened." There was a brief silence as the district officials exchanged looks. Finally, the superintendent spoke. "We're taking this matter seriously. While we cannot go into the specifics of personnel decisions, we can assure you that the principal is being evaluated for his handling of this situation, and further steps will be taken as necessary." Angela nodded, but she wasn't entirely satisfied. She wanted more than just assurances. She wanted to know that there would be concrete consequences for Mr. Stevens' actions. "We appreciate the steps you're taking, but we want to make sure that this isn't just about addressing one incident," Angela said. "We want this to be the beginning of a larger shift in the school's culture. We want our son to feel safe, and we want all students to feel safe. We don't want this to be swept under the rug." The district officials took note of her words. "We understand, Mrs. Johnson. We are committed to making the necessary changes, and we will work with you to ensure that the school environment is one where all students can thrive without fear of discrimination." The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. The district had taken the first steps toward meaningful change, but Angela and Robert knew that they would need to continue to be vigilant. They wouldn't stop advocating for Marcus, and they wouldn't stop pushing for a better, more inclusive environment for all students. When they left the meeting, they felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction. They knew there would be more work to do, more follow-ups, more meetings. But for the first time in a long while, they felt like their voices were being heard. That night, as they sat around the dinner table with Marcus, Angela and Robert shared the news with him. "We had a good meeting with the district," Angela said. "They've agreed to make changes, and they're going to do more to address racism in the school." Marcus looked up from his plate, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Really?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yes, really," Robert said, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. "Things are going to get better. We're going to keep pushing for what's right, and you're not alone in this." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of hope that had been absent for weeks. He wasn't sure how everything would play out, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop fighting for himself and for others like him. As they sat together, a sense of determination settled in the room. This wasn't the end of their journey, it was just the beginning. But with each step forward, they were building something stronger, a future where racism would no longer have a place in their community or in their school. The weeks following the meeting with the school district felt like a turning point, but there was still so much work to be done. The Johnson family had fought hard to be heard, and although they were hopeful for change, they knew that real progress would take time. At school, things had started to shift, but the journey was far from over. Marcus noticed the subtle changes that were happening, but there were still moments when he felt out of place. Some students, especially those who had been involved in the hurtful comments, still kept their distance. However, there were others who came forward to support him, even if it wasn't always in the most obvious ways. One day, Marcus walked into class and was surprised to find a few of his classmates waiting to speak with him. "Hey, Marcus," said one of the girls from his history class, Sarah. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry if I've ever said anything that made you uncomfortable. I never meant to hurt you." Marcus, caught off guard by her apology, nodded. "Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate it." It wasn't the kind of conversation he had expected, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Over the next few days, more students began to reach out to Marcus in different ways. Some apologized, while others simply asked how he was doing. It wasn't a complete transformation, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't completely alone. His classmates were beginning to understand, at least a little, the impact of their actions. But even with these small changes, there were still some challenges. Marcus had always been a quiet, reserved student, and he wasn't used to the spotlight. Now, as more people took notice of what had happened, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of him was glad that things were being addressed, but another part of him wished it could all go back to normal. At home, Angela and Robert continued their efforts to ensure that the changes the district had promised were being implemented. They stayed in close contact with the district, attending meetings and following up on the progress of the new policies. They were committed to seeing this through, not just for Marcus, but for every student at the school who might be silently suffering. The district had started to implement its new diversity training, and the teachers had begun to talk more openly about racism in the classroom. It was encouraging to see the school community beginning to take these issues more seriously. The school had also added a new student support system, where students could report incidents of racism or discrimination without fear of retaliation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One afternoon, as Angela and Robert sat at the kitchen table, they received another call from the district. It was Ms. Lewis again, and this time her tone was more upbeat. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson," she began. I just wanted to let you know that we're holding a special assembly next week to talk about the changes we're making. We'll be introducing the new anti-discrimination policies and discussing how we can all work together to create a safer, more inclusive school environment. We'd like to invite you both to attend. Angela smiled as she listened. That sounds great. We'd love to be there. The assembly was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus was both nervous and curious about what it would be like. It had been weeks since the incident with the police, and the school was finally beginning to address the issue in a public way. Marcus hoped that the assembly would make a real difference, but he also felt apprehensive. He wasn't sure how the students would react or if the assembly would truly lead to lasting change. The day of the assembly arrived, and the gym was filled with students, teachers, and staff. Marcus sat near the back with his friends, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. There were speeches from the principal, some teachers, and even a few students who shared their personal experiences with racism. It was a moment of vulnerability for many, but it also felt like a moment of change. Ms. Lewis, who had been working closely with the Johnson family, took the stage to speak. "We recognize that we've made mistakes," she began, "but we are committed to doing better. We want every student at this school to feel safe, valued, and respected. Today, we are officially launching new policies that will help us address racism more effectively, and we will continue to listen to you, our students, about how we can improve." As the assembly continued, Marcus couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope. The words being spoken were encouraging, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like the school was starting to live up to its promise of inclusion. The students, though somewhat reserved, seemed to be paying attention. Some even nodded along as the speakers talked about the importance of standing up against racism. Later that afternoon, Marcus received a text from one of his classmates, Jake, the same student who had awkwardly spoken to him a few weeks earlier. "Hey Marcus," Jake's message read, "I just wanted to say that I'm glad we had that assembly today. I think it's good that we're talking about this stuff. I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. I'll do better." Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. The conversation wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the end of the story, but it was a step forward. Jake was starting to understand, and that made all the difference. Marcus knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he felt more hopeful about the future. At home, Angela and Robert reflected on the assembly. They were proud of the steps the school had taken, but they knew that the real work had only just begun. They were determined to keep pushing for progress, to make sure that the school continued to live up to its promises. They also knew that their fight for justice didn't end at their son's school. There were other schools, other communities that still needed to address these issues. For Marcus, the experience had been eye-opening. He had learned that it wasn't enough to stay silent when things weren't right. He had learned that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is speak up and fight for what's right, even when it feels like the odds are against you. He knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but he was no longer afraid to face them. As the months went by, Marcus started to feel more confident. The changes at school continued, and while not everything was perfect, he knew that he had played a part in making things better. His parents were proud of him, and he was proud of himself too. In the end, the Johnsons realized that their fight was about more than just one incident. It was about creating a world where all students could feel safe, valued, and respected, no matter their race or background. They knew that change didn't happen overnight, but they were committed to being part of that change, one step at a time.